The Accusing Voice by Meredith Davis. We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Bland, guilty of murder in the first degree in manner and form as charged. Alan Defoe, foreman of the 12 men, listened with impassive face as the judge read away the life of the prisoner in the dock, the man whose death warrant Defoe had signed only a few minutes before. As the judge finished, Defoe glanced warily toward the prisoner. Somehow he preferred to avoid catching his eye. Bland, a slight, rather uninteresting type of man, stood with bowed head. Defoe now turned his gaze full upon him. "Has the prisoner anything to say why judgment should not be pronounced?" The judge's voice, coming after the short pause, sent a strange chill into the heart of Alan Defoe, juror. He hoped the prisoner's counsel would make the customary motions for a new trial or for time in which to file an appeal. He did neither. Evidently, Bland believed the verdict inescapable, or else he was out of funds. Now the judge arose in his place, donning with nervous gesture the black cap that accompanies the most tragic moment in the performance of a court's duties. The judge seemed ill at ease in the cap. It was the first time he had worn it. The grotesque thought flitted through Defoe's mind that perhaps the judge had borrowed the cap from one of his fellow jurors for the occasion. The almost level rays of the western sun diffused a somber, aureate glow athwart the judge's bench, so that the dark figure of the standing man was in mystic indistinctness beyond the shaft of light from the window. A fly now and then craved the spotlight for a moment and lazily floated from the growing dusk of the room to the avenue of ebbing day streaming in from the west. And always there was a constant turmoil of dust particles, visible only when they moved into the bright relief of the sun shaft. The handful of spectators stirred restlessly while the judge was making his preparations. The droning noises of the approaching summer evening in a rural county seat were smothered by the buzz of ill-hushed voices. Perhaps that was why the judge, in the midst of his adjusting his headgear, rapped sharply thrice with his gavel, or it may have been only his excess of nervousness. Defoe thought the judge never would stop fumbling with his cap, and finally the judge lost track of the jury's verdict and had to mess through the scattered papers before him until he found it. He didn't really require it to pronounce sentence of death upon the man in the dock. Hunting it, though, delayed the inevitable a few seconds, and Defoe wondered, since he himself was near to screaming out with impatience, how the prisoner could stand it without going suddenly mad. "For God's sake, read the death sentence!" exclaimed Defoe under his breath, but loud enough to arouse a nod of approval from the two jurors nearest him. A moment later the judge found his voice. "The prisoner will face the court." Slowly, deliberately, the prisoner stepped forward in the dock, leaning slightly against the railing and letting one hand rest upon it. He looked squarely at the judge now, although he barely could distinguish his features in the dimness. Again the judge spoke, and this time his voice was hurried and strained. "The sentence of the court is that the prisoner be taken between the hours of 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. on Tuesday in the week beginning October 22nd next, from the place of confinement to the place of execution, and there be hanged by the neck until he is dead, dead, dead. And may God in his infinite wisdom have mercy on your soul." The judge sank back heavily into the safety of his chair. His hand swept up to brush his forehead, and with the same motion it whisked off the detestable little black cap. The prisoner remained staring at the judge as one who is puzzled at a strange sight. Perhaps he would have stood there untold minutes if a woman's hysterical laugh, half choked by a sudden upraised hand, had not broken the tension of the entire room. A bailiff tiptoed to the woman, and as if revived to duty by the same cause, a prison guard strode forward to lead the condemned man away. Defoe could have reached out and touched Bland as he passed the jury on his way to the cell across the street, but Defoe had no desire even to look at Bland. Indeed, he did not until Bland's back was passing out of sight through the door on the other side of the jury box. Mechanically then, Defoe filed out with the other jurors as the judge announced adjournment. And the black cap lay forgotten on the rim of the judge's wastebasket, where the janitor found it that evening and crossed himself fervently as he timidly salvaged it from ignoble oblivion. 2. Defoe awoke with a shudder. There was a moment or two, as is always the case when one arouses from heavy, dream-burdened slumber, during which Defoe could not tell where his dream ended and realities began. He blinked experimentally into the smouldering fire in the open grate before him. Yes, he was conscious. For further verification of this, he drew forth his watch and noted the hour. The glow from the fire was scarcely sufficient for reading the dial, and Defoe leaned forward the better to see. He was still too drowsy even to reach round and turn on the electric lamp on the table behind him. Still, he was not certain whether he was yet dreaming, until— "Don't budge, Defoe. I've got you covered." The voice was close to his left ear. Its commanding acerbity quelled Defoe's impulse to spring to his feet, and as he gripped the arms of the chair tensely, he managed to challenge his unseen intruder. "Who are you? What do you want here?" The voice moved a little forward and back before it answered. "You've just had a nasty dream, Defoe. Perhaps I—" "How do you know I did?" interrupted Defoe. "You did though, didn't you?" the voice insisted. "Yes, but how did you know?" repeated Defoe. "Never mind how," said the voice. "I'll wager you have had the same dream pretty often in the last dozen years too. It must be hell to have a scene like that forever before your mind, so that you're always in dread of dreaming about it." "What scene?" demanded Defoe. "Are you a mind reader? A wizard? What are you?" The voice chuckled. "None of those," it said. "As I was saying, you must be afraid almost to go to bed at night. I would be if I thought I might dream of sending an innocent man to the gallows." "Stop!" Defoe fairly shouted. "Damn it all, come around here where I can see you." And he made an instinctive move to turn about and confront his tormentor. The firm pressure of an automatic barrel against his temple halted him. "Don't make the mistake of turning around," again warned the voice incisively. Then in a lighter tone it went on. "If I were you in your place, Mr. Defoe, do you know what I'd do?" A pause. Defoe mumbled a faint "No." "Well, I'll either would confess my whole knowledge of the affair, or I'd commit suicide." Defoe started. It was uncanny, eerie, the way this mysterious voice put into words the only gnawing thought that had plagued him the last dozen years of his life. "Of course, you probably have contemplated those alternatives very often," the voice continued. "But have you ever considered doing both? That is, did you ever think that you might confess first, thereby clearing an innocent man's name of murder, and then cheat the law yourself by committing For God's sake, stop that infernal suicide talk!" Defoe snapped. "In the first place, I don't know what affair or what innocent man you're talking about." The voice chuckled again. Defoe was beginning to hate that chuckle more than the feel of the automatic against his head. If the voice kept on chuckling, it might drive him to desperation to grapple with his armed inquisitor, even though he would court certain death in doing it. "Why, there's no need to explain the obvious," the voice replied, its chuckle rippling through the words. "Your dream ought to tell you that." "Speaking of your dream again, Mr. Defoe, reminds me of a question I often wish to ask you. Did you see Bland at all after his conviction?" "No, of course." Defoe's guard had been down. "He was fairly tricked, so he tried to run to cover again." "What? Who is this Bland you're talking about?" Come, Mr. Defoe," said the voice. "Think over your dream a moment. Surely you remember the man in the prisoner's dock, the man who took his sentence with head up, facing the judge like a Spartan. Surely you remember Richard Bland. But did you happen to see him again after that day?" "No," Defoe said. "Why should I have seen him after my connection with his case ended?" "But didn't you even write him a note exposing your regret at having had to perform the duty of—" "Certainly not," interrupted Defoe. "Who ever heard of a foreman of a jury doing such a thing? Besides, he deserved his punishment." The voice was silent a moment or two before it replied. "We'll discuss the merits of the case later. And you didn't even go to see him hanged?" "What manner of man do you think I am?" exclaimed Defoe. "Of course I didn't. I wasn't even in Chicago where he was hanged." "No?" said the voice. "Where were you?" "A few weeks after the trial I had to go to Europe on a long business trip. I was gone a year or so. When I returned to this country I made my home here in New York City." "So you never even read in the newspapers about Bland?" the voice persisted. "I don't suppose the European papers would bother with a piece of American news like that, though." "No, I never read anything about the case after I left this country," said Defoe. "That's odd. I'd have thought you would have followed the case through to the end," the voice said half musingly. "But still, if you had, perhaps you would not be here tonight." "Why not? What difference would it have made?" I don't know, that's merely my surmise, said the voice. A faint footstep padded through the hall outside the living room. Is that you, Manuel? Defoe asked, wondering what would happen when his Cuban valet encountered the intruder behind the chair. The footstep halted. Si, senor, answered the manservant at a respectful distance from his master's chair. I come to see why you sit up so late, senor. Defoe laughed mirthlessly. Well, truth to tell, Manuel, I'm detained on business. And he wondered again how Manuel had escaped noticing the other persons in the room. You mean you fell asleep, senor? Asked the valet. I did, but some friendly caller has kept me pretty well awake the last 10 minutes. But he has gone, and you come to bed now? Inquired the Cuban. Defoe, after a pause, said, Yes, I might as well go to bed, I guess. The voice behind the chair broke in. Tell your valet you will smoke another cigar before you retire. Defoe settled down again in the chair. You heard, Manuel? He asked. You see, my visitor says he wishes me to smoke another cigar. But I see no visitor, senor, said the Cuban. You heard what he said, though, Defoe insisted. No, senor. I only hear you say you wish you to smoke another cigar, explained the valet. Well, you ought to have your ear examined, Manuel. Get my box from the table and hand it to my visitor. Manuel fumbled in the darkness until he found the box, then handed it to Defoe. The latter waved it toward the voice behind him. My guest first, Manuel, he corrected. The Cuban stood motionless. I see no one else, he insisted. The voice interrupted. Tell him I don't care to smoke, Mr. Defoe. I can see no one, senor, the Cuban repeated. But didn't you just hear him? Defoe cried, leaning forward nervously. No, senor, I hear no one speak but you. Defoe stared up at his valet, then half rose from his chair. Sit down, Defoe, commanded the voice sharply. Defoe sank back once more. There, he exclaimed to his valet. Now tell me you didn't hear anyone order me to sit down just then. The Cuban shook his head. No, senor, I hear no one talk but you since I come in. His master swore helplessly. Are you trying to make me a fool of me, Manuel? Do you dare stand there and tell me no one spoke to me? I don't know, senor. I only know I hear no one speak but you. Again the voice intruded. It may be that Manuel thinks you are trying to make a fool of him, it suggested. Do you? Defoe asked the Cuban. Do I what, senor? The valet asked placidly. Do you think I am trying to make a fool of you? I do not say so, do I, senor? The servant replied deprecatingly. No, but you heard. Or did you hear this visitor say it? The Cuban almost tearfully denied it, becoming verbose in his protestation. Defoe flapped his arms on the wings of his easy chair and bade his valet hush. Get out of here, you brown-skinned dumbbell. One of us has gone crazy tonight. The Cuban moved off, keeping a suspicious eye upon his master. His retreating footsteps presently was heard dying away in the hall outside. Well, what do you think of that damned little Cuban? Defoe asked the voice. I wonder what made him lie so brazenly. There was no response. Defoe repeated his second question. Still silence answered him. Have you gone, my friend? Defoe asked, turning part way in his chair to test the other's watchfulness. This time no automatic punched his head, and no command wilted him into the depths of his chair again. Still doubtful of his good luck, Defoe called out once more. I say, stranger, have you gone? The only sound that greeted his ears was a faint creaking of a window in the adjoining dining room. Defoe rose and darted to the connecting door, snapping on the electric light at the entrance to the dining room. The room was vacant of any soul but himself. All he could see was a slight movement of the lace curtain at the dining room window, and when he examined the window, he found it latched. 3. The next day, Defoe went to his doctor. He wished to take stock of himself. Perhaps he had been applying himself too closely to his business. You are badly run down, Alan, the physician said, almost before he had sat down with his patient. You look mentally distressed. I am, admitted Defoe. Working too hard, I guess. The doctor eyed him keenly. Anything else troubling you? He asked. Defoe insisted there really was nothing at all beside his work that was affecting him. So the doctor gave the usual diagnosis. Too much nerve tension, not enough sleep, not the proper kinds of food. He ended up by advising more rest and quiet. And avoid excitement too, he warned. That old heart palpitation might crop up again, you know. It was all very well for the doctor to advise more rest and more sleep, but how was a man to sleep beneath the Damocles sword of mystery, of weird forebodings? It was 3 weeks before Defoe felt that he was succeeding in obeying the doctor's instructions, partly at least. Then it happened late one night. Defoe lay in bed, his back to the lighted electric lamp on the table. He had fallen asleep reading. Suddenly he stirred at a touch on his shoulder. "That you, Manuel?" he asked drowsily. "All right, put out the light." "No, it's not Manuel. And don't bother to turn around, Defoe." This last sharply as Defoe made a movement to arise in bed. "You again!" Defoe exclaimed. "What? How did you get in?" "That's my problem, not yours," said the voice. "I merely dropped in again to inquire if you had thought any more of doing what I suggested." Defoe checked an insane desire to leap out of bed and make a break for the door, anything to escape this tormentor at his back, but he remembered the automatic. He got himself under a semblance of control before he answered. "Your suggestions were ridiculous. Why should I have anything to confess about the Bland trial, or why should I commit suicide over it?" He even essayed a laugh meant to be derisive, but the intruder chose to ignore Defoe's evasions. His next remark was as startling as it was illuminating. "Did you know," said the voice, "that of the other 11 jurors who convicted Bland, only 7 are living still?" "No, I haven't kept track of the other 11 men," replied Defoe, annoyed subconsciously by the detachment that voice gave to the word still. "Well, I have," said the voice. 2 of the surviving 7 are in insane asylums. 2 of the 4 dead committed suicide. Defoe could brook it no longer. He wrenched around in bed to grapple with his antagonist, forgetful in his madness of the automatic. But before he could free himself from the bedclothes, the lamp was snapped out, and Defoe was left ignominiously tumbled in the darkness on the floor. A chuckle from the vicinity of the bedroom door told him of his guest's departure. When morning came after the nerve-wracking night, Defoe found it hard to realize that his 2 experiences with the voice really had taken place. Nonetheless, he knew they were preying on his vitality, on his brain functions. Repeatedly the thought came to him that it was all a dream, like his recollection of the murder trial out of which he had awakened the night of the voice's first visit. But always, against the theory of the dream, he placed his remembrance of the feel of the automatic revolver. And too, the fact that he had talked with Manuel and the voice at the same time argued against the dream explanation. Left then was conscience, that is, if the visits of the voice were simply hallucinations of a distracted mind. But why should conscience wait for 12 years to haunt and harass him? The more he pondered it all, the greater became the dread of another visit from the voice. The greater grew his fear, too, of losing his reason as he sought to analyze the situation from every conceivable standpoint. With every new bit of theorizing, Defoe felt himself giving way more and more to melancholia, such as he knew is frequently but the prelude to insanity. Was it possible, he wondered, for a man's conscience to drive him to imbecility? Defoe finally accepted the inevitable. "Manuel," he ordered, the second morning after the bedroom encounter with the voice, "pack my things. We're going away." "Away, Senor? Where?" Defoe's brain groped vainly for an instant, then seized upon the only chance. "The sea. A sea voyage. My nerves." Manuel busied himself among Defoe's clothes. "Do you need many things, Senor? Do you go far away? Europe, perhaps?" No, just down the coast. Old Point Comfort, I guess. Yes, that's it. A week or so of rest. Just my steamer trunk and a suitcase will do." The day of the trip down the coast was as perfect as he could have wanted for his own satisfaction. All during the forenoon, the Old Dominion steamer skirted the Jersey shoreline, and Defoe sat out on deck, basking in the sun, and already feeling better for the salt-laden air that he breathed in deeply. In the afternoon, he napped most of the time, and when nightfall chilled the deck promenades, he descended with rest to the dining saloon. It was while sitting in the smoking saloon after dinner that Defoe first had the impression that he was being watched. A poker game was going on lackadaisically in one corner of the saloon. Scattered in chairs and cushioned seats along the windows were perhaps a dozen or 15 men. But for the life of him, Defoe could not pick out any one in the room who might be watching him. Now he gave his fleeting impression indulgence long enough to look about him. Finishing a cigar, Defoe decided on a deck stroll before retiring. It was too cold and damp, with the fog beginning to gather, to permit of sitting on deck, So he paced to and fro briskly up near the foredeck beneath the pilot's tower. The nervousness of the few moments in the smoking salon, when he imagined himself being watched, transmuted itself into a shiver as a foggy dampness penetrated to his marrow. He lit a fresh cigar and puffed at it jerkily as if to generate bodily warmth. Presently the shiver developed into veritable shudders such as precedes chills or certain forms of ague. Therefore, thoroughly miserable and alarmed now at the fear of sickness on board ship, chafed his cheeks with his hands, and on his way to the entrance to the stateroom, he flailed his arms about himself to stem the onrush of the chill. Once inside the passageway of the staterooms, however, he felt warmer, and by the time he reached his stateroom door, the chill had subsided almost completely. He was still uncomfortably cold, though, as he opened the door. With one hand, he unbuttoned his overcoat, and with the other, he reached gropingly for the electric light button on the wall. He fumbled around for it a few seconds, then swore softly in vexation because he had not noticed by daylight just where it was located. Groping with both hands now, he stumbled around the none too commodious room, feeling for the push button on the wall. He paused once and took inventory of his pockets and cursed his luck for lack of another match. Then he went to hunting in the dark again, until his hand came full against a living body. 4. The body stirred, eluding Defoe's contact. Defoe fell to quaking once more, but it was not the trembling of the chill this time. He opened his mouth to challenge the intruder, and all he could do was swallow and gag at the words that stuck in his throat. A pressure against the pit of his stomach, a firm shove of a hand upon his shoulder, and Defoe found himself stepping backward until it seemed he must have walked the length of the ship. But of course he hadn't. He hadn't even left the stateroom. And suddenly he was tumbled onto the edge of the berth, the pressure against his abdomen increasing. A vague nausea gripped him. He clutched at his abdomen and his fingers wrapped themselves around the barrel of an automatic pistol. The pressure against his body became unbearable, piercing. Defoe crumpled back into the berth, and the convulsive effort restored his speech. "What the hell are you doing?" he exploded. "Get out of here! What are you trying to do? Stab me with a pistol?" The incongruity of his question aroused a titter of amusement from the invisible presence. "No, I only wished to make sure you weren't trying to get away." That voice again. "Here!" Defoe cringed in a sort of abject fear. "What are you? Who are you?" Defoe struggled to keep his voice steady, struggled indeed to keep his reason from flying out of balance and shattering him into 1,000 pieces of drivelling idiocy. "Call me anything you care to," replied the voice in the dark. "I don't believe you're anything at all. I think you're all a dream, a nightmare, a damnable hallucination that I can't get rid of. To hell with you. I'm going to go down to the smoking room and smoke you out of my mind. I'm going to stay in the light from now on, day and night, until I get over this morbid dreaming." Defoe really thought he meant it all until the pressure against his stomach made him doubt his courage and defiance. Perhaps it was a nausea, maybe seasickness. He never had thought of that. That was gripping his vitals like the insistent pressure of a steel-barreled weapon. "Sit down, Mr. Defoe," commanded the voice. "I've got something to say to you." "To hell with you," Defoe repeated almost hysterically now. His hands clutched at the pressure again, and once more the pistol barrel sent him squirming back into the recesses of the berth. "I want to talk to you some more about the Bland case," went on the voice, unperturbed by the other's outburst. "When are you going to confess?" "Confess?" Defoe parried. "Confess what?" "Confess that you knew Bland was innocent when you convicted him," said the voice. "But I didn't." It was like wrestling with one's conscience. Defoe thought, this interminable denying of Bland's innocence, he was wearying of it all. His mind was revolting at the repeated third degree of this mysterious voice. Soon he feared his brain would refuse to function. "But you have said you did," the voice insisted. "When?" "It's a lie," exclaimed Defoe. The voice chuckled, sending a shudder through the man crouching in the corner of the berth. "You probably don't know, Mr. Defoe, that for a number of years you have had the treacherous habit of talking in your sleep, talking volubly, excitedly, sometimes almost reconstructing entire incidents in your talk for the benefit of anyone who might happen to be listening." "Well?" asked Defoe. "Simply this. Manuel has overheard enough to—" "Manuel?" broke in Defoe. "What's he got to do with it?" "I forgot to tell you," the voice apologized. The Cuban is my confederate, former member of the secret police of Havana, you know. I saved his life during the Spanish War, and, well, he's paying back an old debt as he calls it. He let me in and out of your house and tipped me off about this trip. You see, Manuel had overheard you say in your sleep that you convicted an innocent man of murder. So I knew your conscience. Are you trying to be my conscience? Are you trying to plague me into confessing? Are you— No, answered the voice, unless you choose to call me your conscience. I'm willing. You seem to be in need of one. Do you know, Mr. Defoe? And the voice took on a more affable tone. You have been fearfully distracted the last few weeks or months. You need a rest. A long rest. Defoe was silent, hunched in the retreat of the bath. He had no fight left in him. Presently he fell to whimpering quietly as a child does when it is punished beyond endurance and is too frightened to cry. The voice, it seemed, missed the old combativeness, gone so quickly after Defoe's late outburst. So it prodded the hunted man with its chief weapon, not its pistol, but its chuckle. This time it chuckled devilishly, aggravatingly, and it rasped against the tender sensibilities of the snivelling Defoe like salt in an open wound. Then something broke what little bonds of restraint remained in Defoe. He sprang cat-like to the outer edge of the berth and lunged for the arm that held the pistol. In the darkness, his head struck the cross-support of the berth above, and he slumped forward, half-dazed by the blow. Again the chuckle sounded in his ears, now ringing with a stunning impact, and again Defoe lurched forward, only to fall dizzily to the floor. He clambered clumsily to his feet, gripping the berth for a momentary prop. Soon his head began to clear. He was assembling out of the maze of ache and buzzing in his ears and brain some sort of coherent idea of where he was and what had been happening. "Now I know what it all means," he burst forth presently. You sneaking, cackling little conscience, get out of here. I'm going to cheat you if I have to become a drunkard or a dope fiend the rest of my life. I'm not going to let a conscience or a voice or a chuckle drive me to insanity, or to confessing, or to suicide. Defoe was steady enough now, supporting himself against the upper berth. His voice grew more strident. "No, I'm not going to let my conscience get the best of me. You thought you could keep after me endlessly, but I'll get rid of you. I'm never going to be bothered with you or your voice again. Never. Now, get out of here. Get out of here, I say." A chuckle, a croaking, sepulchral chuckle it was now, answered him out of the darkness. "You might tell me before I go if you know who really did kill the man Bland was convicted of murdering," said the voice. "I'm curious enough to wish to know his name." And the voice chuckled once more. "Damn the cackle. I'll tell you if you choke off that infernal cackling. I'll tell you, yes, I can tell you, because I did it. I committed that murder, you understand? I did it. Now cackle all you want to, and I convicted Bland of it. Cackle, you damn little shriveled conscience. Oh, ho, ho, ho. I think it's my own turn to cackle now." The words of the hysterical man rose to a maudlin scream that reverberated piercingly in the little stateroom. "Now get out of here for good," the raving Defoe shouted, recovering coherence of speech after a time. "Get out before I—" A blinding glare of light came as Defoe reached for the door. The intruder had found the push button. Defoe stared, then toppled to the floor. "Bland! Bland! You! It's you!" And before the stranger that was Bland passed from the room, he felt again of the heart of the craven hulk at his feet. The doctor had been right. The tumult in the breast of the 12th juror had been too much. If only Defoe had known that the governor had pardoned Bland, his secret might have been safe forever.
An Authenticated Vampire Story by Dr. Franz Hartmann. On June 10th, 1909, there appeared in a prominent Vienna newspaper, the News Wiener Journal, a notice, which I herewith enclose, saying that the castle of B had been burned by the populace because there was a great mortality among the peasant children, and it was generally believed that this was due to the invasion of a vampire, supposed to be the last Count B, who died and acquired that reputation. The castle was situated in a wild and desolate part of the Carpathian Mountains, and was formerly a fortification against the Turks. It was not inhabited, owing to its being believed to be in the possession of ghosts, Only a wing of it was used as a dwelling for the caretaker and his wife. Now it so happened that when I read the above notice, I was sitting in a coffee house at Vienna, in company with an old friend of mine who is an experienced occultist, an editor of a well-known journal, and who had spent several months in the neighborhood of the castle. From him I obtained the following account, and it appears that the vampire in question was probably not the old count, but his beautiful daughter, the Countess Elga, whose photograph, taken from the original painting, I obtained. My friend said, 2 years ago I was living at Hermannstadt, and being engaged in engineering a road through the hills, I often came within the vicinity of the old castle, where I made the acquaintance of the old castellan, or caretaker, and his wife, who occupied a part of the wing of the house, almost separate from the main body of the building. They were a quiet old couple and rather reticent in giving information, or expressing an opinion in regard to the strange noises which were often heard at night in the deserted halls, or of the apparitions which the Wallachian peasants claimed to have seen when they loitered in the surroundings after dark. All I could gather was that the old count was a widower, and had a beautiful daughter, who was one day killed by a fall from her horse, and that soon after the old man died in some mysterious manner, and the bodies were buried in a solitary graveyard belonging to a neighboring village. Not long after their death an unusual mortality was noticed among the inhabitants of the village. Several children, and even some grown people, died without any apparent illness. They merely wasted away, and thus a rumor was started that the old count had become a vampire after his death. There was no doubt that he was not a saint, as he was addicted to drinking, and some shocking tales were in circulation about his conduct and that of his daughter. But whether or not there was any truth in them, I am not in a position to say. Afterwards the property came into the possession of Blank, a distant relative of the family, who was a young man and officer in a cavalry regiment at Vienna. It appears that the heir enjoyed his life at the capital, and did not trouble himself much about the old castle in the wilderness. He did not even come to look at it, but gave his directions by letter to the old janitor, telling him merely to keep things in order and to attend repairs if any were necessary. Thus the castellan was actually master of the house, and offered its hospitality to me and my friends. One evening myself and my 2 assistants, Dr. E., a young lawyer, and Mr. W., a literary man, went to inspect the premises. First we went to the stables. There were no horses, as they had been sold, but what had attracted our special attention was an old queer-fashioned coach, with gilded ornaments and bearing the emblems of the family. We then inspected the rooms, passing through some halls and gloomy corridors, such as may be found in any old castle. There was nothing remarkable about the furniture, but in one of the halls there hung in a frame an oil painting, a portrait representing a lady with a large hat and wearing a fur coat. We all were involuntarily startled on beholding this picture, not so much on account of the beauty of the lady, but on account of the uncanny expression of her eyes, and Dr. E., after looking at the picture for a short time, suddenly exclaimed, "How strange! The picture closes its eyes and opens them again, and now it begins to smile." Now, Dr. E. is a very sensitive person, and has more than once had some experience in spiritism, and we made up our minds to form a circle for the purpose of investigating this phenomenon. Accordingly, on the same evening we sat around a table in an adjoining room, forming a magnetic chain with our hands. Soon the table began to move, and the name Elga was spelled. We asked who this Elga was, and the answer was rapped out: the lady whose picture you have seen. "Is the lady living?" asked Mr. W. This question was not answered, but instead it was rapped out: "If W. desires it, I will appear to him boldly tonight at 2 o'clock." W. consented. And now the table seemed to be endowed with life, and manifested a great affection for W. It rose on 2 legs and pressed against his breast, as if it intended to embrace him. We inquired of the castellan whom the picture represented, but to our surprise he did not know. He said that it was the copy of a picture painted by the celebrated painter Hans Marquardt, of Vienna, and had been bought by the old count because its demoniacal look pleased him so much. We left the castle, and W. retired to his room at an inn, a half-hour's journey distant from that place. He was of a somewhat skeptical turn of mind, being neither a firm believer in ghosts and apparitions nor ready to deny their possibility. He was not afraid, but anxious to see what would come out of his agreement, and for the purpose of keeping himself awake, he sat down and began to write an article for a journal. Towards 2 o'clock he heard steps on the stairs, and the door of the hall opened. There was a rustling of a silk dress, and the sound of the feet of a lady walking to and fro in the corridor. It may be imagined that he was somewhat startled, but taking courage, he said to himself, "If this is Elga, let her come in." Then the door of his room opened, and Elga entered. She was most elegantly dressed, and appeared still more youthful and seductive than the picture. There was a lounge on the other side of the table where W. was writing, and there she silently posted herself. She did not speak, but her looks and gestures left no doubt in regard to her desires and intentions. Mr. W. resisted the temptation and remained firm. It is not known whether he did so out of principle or timidity or fear. Be this as it may, he kept on writing, looking from time to time at his visitor and silently wishing that she would leave. At last, after half an hour, which seemed to him much longer, the lady departed in the same manner in which she came. This adventure left W. no peace, and we consequently arranged several sittings at the old castle, where a variety of uncanny phenomena took place. Thus, for instance, once the servant girl was about to light a fire in the stove, when the door of the apartment opened and Elga stood there. The girl, frightened out of her wits, rushed out of the room, tumbling down the stairs in terror, with the petroleum lamp in her hand, which broke and came very near to setting her clothes on fire. Lighted lamps and candles went out when brought near the picture, and many other manifestations took place which it would be tedious to describe. But the following incident ought not to be omitted. Mr. W. was at that time desirous of obtaining the position as co-editor of a certain journal. In a few days after the above-narrated adventure, he received a letter in which a noble lady of high position offered him her patronage for that purpose. The writer requested him to come to a certain place the same evening, where he would meet a gentleman who would give him further particulars. He went, and was met by an unknown stranger who told him that he was requested by the Countess Elga to invite Mr. W. to a carriage drive, and that she would await him at midnight at a certain crossing of two roads, not far from the village. The stranger then suddenly disappeared. Now it seems that Mr. W. had some misgivings about the meeting and drive, and he hired a policeman as detective to go at midnight to the appointed place to see what would happen. The policeman went and reported next morning that he had seen nothing but the well-known old-fashioned carriage from the castle with two black horses attached to it, standing there as if waiting for somebody, and that he had no occasion to interfere, and merely waited until the carriage moved on. When the castellan of the castle was asked, he swore that the carriage had not been out that night, and in fact it could not have been out, as there were no horses to draw it. But this is not all, for on the following day I met a friend who was a great skeptic and disbeliever in ghosts, and always used to laugh at such things. Now, however, he seemed to be very serious, and said, "Last night something very strange happened to me. At about 1 o'clock this morning I returned from a late visit, and as I happened to pass the graveyard of the village, I saw a carriage with gilded ornaments standing at the entrance. I wondered about this taking place at such an unusual hour, and being curious to see what would happen, I waited. Two elegantly dressed ladies issued from the carriage. One of these was young and pretty, but threw at me a devilish and scornful look as they both passed by and entered the cemetery. There they were met by a well-dressed man, who saluted the ladies and spoke to the younger one, saying, 'Why, Miss Elga, are you returning so soon?' Such a queer feeling came over me that I abruptly left and hurried home." This matter has not been explained, but certain experiments which we subsequently made with the picture of Elga brought out some curious facts. To look at the picture for a certain time caused me to feel a very disagreeable sensation in the region of the solar plexus. I began to dislike the portrait, and proposed to destroy it. We held a sitting in the adjoining room. The table manifested a great aversion against my presence. It was rapped out that I should leave the circle, and that the picture must not be destroyed. I ordered a Bible to be brought in and read the beginning of the first chapter of St. John, whereupon the above-mentioned Mr. E., the medium, and another man present claimed that they saw the picture distorting its face. I turned the frame and pricked the back of the picture with my penknife in different places, and Mr. E., as well as the other man, felt all the pricks, although they had retired to the corridor. I made the sign of the pentagram over the picture, and again the two gentlemen claimed that the picture was horribly distorting its face. Soon afterwards we were called away and left that country. Of Elga I heard nothing more. Thus far goes the account of my friend the editor. There are several points in it which call for an explanation. Perhaps the sages of the SPR will find it, by investigating the laws of nature ruling the astral plane, unless they prefer to take the easier route, by proclaiming it all to be humbug and fraud.
The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. For the most wild, yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad I am not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me they have presented little but horror. To many they will seem less terrible than baroques. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive in the circumstances I detail with awe nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From my infancy I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black, and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mention the matter at all for no better reason than that it happens just now to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend Intemperance, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected them, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when by accident or through affection they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me, for what disease is like alcohol, and at length even Pluto, who was now becoming old and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him when, in his fright at my violence, he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, thrilled every fiber of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, shudder while I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse for the crime of which I had been guilty, but it was, at best, a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess, and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation. And then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit philosophy takes no account, yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not, hundreds of times, found himself committing a vile or silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination, in the teeth of our best judgment, to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning in cold blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree. Hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes and the bitterest remorse at my heart. Hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no offense. Hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a deadly sin, that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. On the night of the day on which this cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames. The whole house was blazing. It was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforward to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of facts, and wish not to leave even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in a compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had here, in great measure, resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to its having been recently spread. About this wall a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with very minute and eager attention. The words strange, singular, and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in bas-relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvelous. There was a rope about the animal's neck. When I first beheld this apparition, for I could scarcely regard it as less, my wonder and my terror were extreme. But at length reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by some one of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown through an open window into my chamber. This had probably been done with the view of arousing me from sleep. The falling of the other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, had then accomplished the portraiture, as I saw it. although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact just detailed, it did not the less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period there came back into my spirit a half-sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and to look about me, among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented, for another pet of the same species and of somewhat similar appearance, with which to supply its place. One night as I sat, half stupefied, in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin, or of rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect, but only Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite, splotch of white, covering nearly the whole region of the breast. Upon my touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it of the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once, and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed me. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not, for some weeks, strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence as from the breath of a pestilence. What added, no doubt, to my hatred of the beast was the discovery, on the morning after I brought it home, that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed in a high degree that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinacity which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or, fastening its long and sharp claws in my dress, clamber in this manner to my breast. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from so doing, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I am almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell I am almost ashamed to own, that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of white hair of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had, at length, assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this above all I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a hideous, of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. O mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death! And now I was indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast, whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to work out for me, a man, fashioned in the image of the high God, so much of insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former, the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear, to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face and its vast weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressures of torments such as these, the feeble remnants of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind, while, from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me upon some household errand into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and, nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe, and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which, of course, would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot, without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith and with entire deliberation to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. Many projects entered my mind. At one period I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again, I deliberated about casting it into the well in the yard, about packing it in a box as if merchandise with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed, and had lately been plastered throughout with a rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection caused by a false chimney or fireplace that had been filled up and made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar I easily dislodged the bricks, and, having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while, with little trouble, I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, "Here, at least then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had at length firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet it at that moment, there could have been no doubt about its fate, but it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger, and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the deep, the blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus, for one night at least, since its introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept, even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a free man. The monster in terror had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came very unexpectedly into the house and proceeded again to make a rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatever. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not in a muscle. My heart beat as calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say but one word by way of triumph, and to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house." In the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. "I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls— Are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together." And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane which I held in my hand, upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch-fiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry, at first muffled and broken, like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have risen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony, and of the demons that exult in the damnation. Of my thoughts it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For an instant the party upon the stairs remained motionless, through extremity of terror and of awe. In the next moment a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already getting decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red, extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb.